All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're glad that you could join us this afternoon for our virtual symposium. This symposium was actually supposed to take place at our annual meeting in March, but thanks to our pandemic, we had to bring it to you virtually, but we're excited that we have the opportunity to do so. My name is Desiree Bryant. I am RPA's Director of Meetings. So again, thank you for joining us. A few housekeeping notes for you. All lines in this webinar will be muted, so you won't be able to ask any questions or verbally or anything like that. You'll only be in listen-only mode. We will have a Q&A session immediately after the presentation, and you can put your question in the Q&A box. In the Q&A box, if you look at the top of your screen, you should see a box that has like a little dialogue, and that's where you're going to put your Q&A. You'll also see a little emoji, and that emoji is for you to give us a thumbs up, you know, if you agree with something. As a matter of fact, you can practice now. So if everyone can give me a thumbs up and let me know that you know where the Q&A is, that'd be great. This is going to be recorded, and the recording will be on our website, so that you'll be able to find that afterwards. It will also be in our e-learning platform. So now what I'm going to do is turn it over to Tana Chmieleski, and I hope I got that right because I spelled it phonetically, and she will be moderating the session. Tana, take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much. And that was correct. I love seeing all the thumbs up coming through. So thanks, you guys. And thank you all for being so flexible. I know Bob and I were really looking forward to being at the conference with you guys in March. So thank you for adapting and pivoting into this virtual world that we're all currently living in. So we wanted to start out just really by saying thank you. This deck was intended to really speak to you guys about how we are supporting you and how we can better support you in your treatment of patients and the management of secondary hyperparathyroidism. So thank you for all the work that you're doing, and again for being so flexible with us here today. So just as a few reminders, this is definitely a promotional program on behalf of Amgen. Bob and I are actually part of the Amgen team, and this has been reviewed by us and our internal review process as well. And just to kind of set some parameters here on Parsabiv and also Sensipar with our indications and limitations of use. We'll go into more detail of the important safety information later on in the deck, as I know that that can be a heavier subject to cover. So first and foremost, the indications for Parsabiv. It is indicated for the treatment of secondary hyperparathyroidism in adult patients with CKD on hemodialysis. Sensipar in its tablet form is indicated for the treatment of secondary HPT and adult patients with CKD on dialysis as well. There are some limitations of use with Parsabiv that it has not been studied in adult patients with primary parathyroid carcinoma, primary hyperparathyroidism, or in patients with CKD who are not on hemodialysis. Sensipar itself is also not recommended in patients with CKD who are not on dialysis because of the increased risk of hypocalcemia. So with that, the gratitude. We've been with you guys for 30 plus years in the nephrology space, starting from our ESA molecules from Epogen to Aranest, and now into the calcimimetics with Sensipar, and now into the IV calcimimetic of Parsabiv. So our goal has always been to support you guys, the prescribers, in your patient care in the management of these patients. So thank you for everything that you've done. Since November, we have some new data. Through November of 2019, so far there are just over 56,000 patient years of patients on Parsabiv in the US. And when we look at this data globally, we actually see just over 95,000 patient years. So we've come a long way from getting our FDA approval in 2018. So just to kind of give you the lay of the land here, I'm going to just hit a few points about SHBT, go over a couple clinical information and also some new evidence that we have called real world evidence, some real life in practice data. And then I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Bob to go over some coverage and reimbursement for you guys as well, as I know we definitely have decision day coming upon us soon. So to get started about SHBT, just a little history lesson here as we're all familiar. In 2010, the KDIGO guidelines were updated and they stated that the management and treatment of CKD-MBD should be based on serial assessment. So we should not be considering one individual key metric by itself. We really need to look at the patient holistically and what all of those labs are telling you. So with that, individually, the PTH metrics, though, remain consistent. So remember in 2003, the PTH was expanded from 150 to 300. Have to reach back in my mind there for that one. And expanded from 150 to 300 to 600. So the goal was was that we were hopefully getting more patients within goal. And the next slide will show you kind of the last lens of this, of where we are as of 2018. But regardless, the KDIGO has recommended that PTH should avoid going over 600, that at that point we should have an intervention. But again, taking into a serial assessment with phosphorus and calcium as well. With phosphorus, the KDIGO guidelines have always recommended to lowering and keeping them within the normal range. And then a new language was introduced for calcium in 2017, where it suggested avoiding hypercalcemia and no longer gave an exact measurement for you. So with that, this is the DOPS data. So this is going to be the Dialysis Outcomes and Practice Study, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. This is a cohort study looking at the patient populations by their PTH range over the last 8 years. So as we can see in 2010, those patients that had a PTH greater than 600 were at 11%. As of February 2018, that percentage had more than doubled. And taking into account that we had expanded the guidelines to include those patients that were within range from that 130 to 600, we've still seen that population increase over time. So getting into some of the clinical data for Parsabiv, I'm going to introduce you to some of our placebo-controlled studies, which I'm sure you're well versed in as well, and also our head-to-head, just to give you some refreshers. So the 2 placebo-controlled studies are where we got our FDA approval. So patients were randomized 1-to-1 to either Parsabiv or placebo. And keep in mind that placebo was essentially the standard of care. They could be treated with or without vitamin D and phosphate binders, as the doctors and investigators saw appropriate. Keeping in mind here, the average baseline of the mean PTH for these patients was in the 800s. We had 847 and 836 respectively. So again, these patients are already outside of that KDIGO goal range of 600. This was also a 26-week study, and the primary endpoint was to see the patients who had a greater than 30% reduction in their PTH by the end of the study. Clicking the wrong button here for you. There we go. So the starting dose of Parsabiv was always on label at 5 milligrams administered 3 times a week with hemodialysis. We did active titration every 4 weeks until the patients met their PTH treatment goal of 300. Parsabiv may have been withheld if their PTH went below 100, as we do not want to oversuppress bone and have a dynamic bone disease. And it was also withheld if the corrected calcium levels went below 7.5, or if they showed any signs of symptomatic hypocalcemia or any ongoing adverse events. Vitamin D, as we mentioned, was used, and in the last 6 weeks of the study, the efficacy assessment phase, there was an average of 16 and 14 mics per treatment group. And throughout the study, the average dose of Parsabiv was 7.2 milligrams, and that was, again, with active titration every 4 weeks. Looking at the primary endpoint, we see that 78% of patients met the treatment goal of achieving that greater than 30% reduction in their mean PTH. That's compared to placebo, which again was vitamin D and phosphate binders if prescribed. Looking at the PTH by segmentations, we see that 73% of patients achieved closer to that treatment goal of 300 if their baseline PTH was within 400 to 600. We see this as the patient population grows and moves up into those more compromised and advanced disease, and that's 600 to 1,000 and greater than 1,000, we see less efficacy even with the treatment of Parsabiv. So patients that have advanced disease that have a PTH greater than 1,000, we see a 30% reduction in their PTH, which is still a lot. That's still getting a lot of patients to treatment goal. But we obviously see that that advanced disease is starting to take effect in those populations that are greater than 600 as well. Looking then into the open label extension study. So Parsabiv is the only calcimimetic that has up to 78 weeks of data. So after our two pooled placebo-controlled trials, we then did a washout phase and then offered for the attendees to opt in who were on the placebo to start on a Parsabiv trial. Again, all patients were washed out, even the patients on Parsabiv, and everyone was restarted at a 5 milligram dose, which is on our label by the FDA, and it was dosed 3 times a week with hemodialysis. It's also important to remember that the investigators were blinded to the PTH results for the first 10 weeks. So while they had visibility to calcium, that was for a safety measurement only. Everything else was monitored by a treatment algorithm during this study. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you see the two-phased placebo-controlled studies, and you see the significant reductions of the 48% at week 26. The gray bar represents the 30-day washout phase, and then you see the Parsabiv arm, those patients who were on in the placebo-controlled trial who continued out to 78 weeks. And then the dotted line are those patients who were on placebo and then moved to Parsabiv during our open label extension. So you see those patients had a PTH trending up to almost 936 of PTH, still were able to achieve reductions down to 401, which kept them within the KDIGO goals. Those patients who had been on Parsabiv not only stayed reduced, but they also maintained out to those 78 weeks as well. We saw similar results when we looked at phosphorus as well. Again, on the left-hand side, you have the data from the placebo-controlled trial, the washout, and then the patients who switched over to Parsabiv from the placebo. Again, starting at just over 5.9, just under 6 for that placebo arm, and both arms of the study reaching to just around 5 at the end of the open label extension. And looking at calcium, corrected calcium, we see a very similar story as well. Here you see for those patients in the placebo-controlled study, their calcium did not move at all from 9.7 to 9.7. And then once they were started on Parsabiv, we did see a reduction in their corrected calcium from that 9.7 down to 8.9, just keeping them in a more comfortable range within that normal guidance from KDIGO. Looking then into what we consider the composite scores, looking at a post hoc analysis, kind of measuring by KDIGO, for all those patients who met all 3 key metrics, we saw that 51% of patients in this study who were treated with Parsabiv met that composite goal, meaning PTH, phosphorus, and calcium were all within range. When we look at those individual SHBT measurements, 85% of patients on Parsabiv met the KDIGO guideline, 62% of patients met their phosphorus, and 94% met their calcium KDIGO guideline target ranges as well. And all of this again versus placebo, which is vitamin D and phosphate binders, which again is a traditional standard of care that most patients are on during their dialysis. And then looking at adverse reaction. So this study varied slightly from our original studies with oral cinacalcet because we learned at this point that the goal of calcimimetics, of course, is to lower calcium. So we separated this out. So you'll see a higher incidence for blood calcium decreases at 64%. This is asymptomatic blood calcium decreases, meaning that they were monitored and an intervention may have been taken to adjust, whether it be vitamin D or an intake of calcium through dietary, but they were not symptomatic. You see the hypocalcemia at the bottom of 7% versus 0.2% for the placebo arm, and that is clinically diagnosed symptomatic hypocalcemia. Here you can see, as we know with calcimimetics, the GI side effects of diarrhea, nausea, and vomiting. They were fairly consistent in the Parsabiv arm, and you'll see some further data when we look at the head-to-head as well, but obviously versus placebo, There were some higher variances in it with Parsabiv, but what this did tell us is that obviously this patient population is sick. They don't feel well anyways. So Parsabiv was not helping them, but it also wasn't increasing it as severely as we've seen some experiences with Sensipar in the past. Now, looking into the head-to-head study, we wanted to see how these two compare to each other, obviously, and we do have some constraints here. Sensipar is a QD dosing, and since this was a clinical trial, it was given on label QD starting at 30 milligrams. Parsabiv on label at 5 milligrams 3 times a week. So there are some variances here, but on both arms of the study, we still had active titrations every 4 weeks where it was appropriate for the patients. Also keeping in mind clinical trial. In our past, in the 15 plus years that you guys have had experience with Sensipar, we know one of the biggest struggles with patients has been patient compliance. During this head-to-head trial, we saw a 97% adherence rate for Parsabiv and 94% adherence rates for Sensipar. So if any of you are achieving that in your clinics without any clinical trials or assistance, I applaud you. Because that is impressive. So obviously clinical trial, we definitely had more control over the patient adherence at this point. The average dose, just to keep in mind, was consistent with Parsabiv from our placebo. It was about 7 milligrams per treatment. It was Sensipar, we averaged just around that 40-45 point, and that would be per day. So again, they were randomized 1-to-1, and again, phosphate binders and vitamin D were given if it was appropriate for the patient. And what we saw, and just to keep in mind that this was a non-inferiority study, so this was not powered to show superiority at all. What this showed us, though, is that over 3/4 of patients achieved that 30% reduction in the mean PTH. So just under 78% with Parsabiv versus 63% with Sensipar. And again, keeping in mind those adherence rates as well. So while it was non-inferior, it did meet its primary endpoint as well. So I have some additional data that I want to share with you, but it's just important to note that because the primary endpoint was met, the statistical analysis for the secondary measurements for nausea and vomiting were done, and they did not meet their statistical significance. So everything I'm going to show you is going to be analysis, but it will not have a significance value to it. It's just a percent change from the EAP of the open label extension in the head-to-head. So here we wanted to look at the PTH, phosphorus, and calcium compared to each other. So on the top graph, you see Parsabiv versus Sensipar, and the same for phosphorus and for corrected calcium. This analysis, again, is exploratory and has not been adjusted for multiple comparisons. So just showing that even in the head-to-head, both patients' groups here were well outside of the KDIGO goals of over 600. And with Parsabiv, PTH was achieved down to a mean PTH of 579, and with Sensipar 723. Again, we see further reductions in phosphorus and also with corrected calcium with Parsabiv than we were able to see with Sensipar. And again, looking at those PTH segmentations kind of by groupings with the less than 600, 600 to 1,000, and greater than 1,000. What this exploratory analysis showed us that, again, with those patients that have a PTH less than 600, this is where we saw the greater reductions of patients meeting that the PTH goal of less than 600. So if we're starting before they get over 600, we're seeing more reductions there as well. As the disease advances and we get to that 600 to 1,000 and greater than 1,000, you see it go down almost by half, from 44% to 25% when a patient's PTH is outside of 1,000. And in the head-to-head study, to see how these guys lined up with their adverse events between Parsabiv and Sensipar, we did break down the blood calcium decreases as well as the hypocalcemia for both of these molecules. So here you'll see for Sensipar, there was a 60% blood calcium decrease, meaning it was asymptomatic. Action was taken to increase calcium, but they were not symptomatic hypocalcemia. 69% for Parsabiv. And then again, the nausea and vomiting and diarrhea are always going to be the GI side effects that we're very sensitive to. Here you can see with Parsabiv, there was 18% for nausea, 23% with Sensipar, 13% for vomiting versus 14%, and then 6 versus 10% for diarrhea between Parsabiv and Sensipar respectively. Now, the important safety information. For both of these drugs, as we know, they are intended to decrease serum calcium. So depending on the patient, that can lead to some forms of hypocalcemia, sometimes severe. And it's important to monitor because significant lowering can have a further impact on QT interval prolongation and ventricular arrhythmia. Some cases of QT interval prolongation had been reported in the patients treated with Sensipar, and some of those patients had been predisposed to those worsening heart conditions. So it's just important to continuously monitor those patients. As we know, seizures may also be a symptom of hypocalcemia and also concurrent administration. It's important that if you are using one or both of these calcimimetics, that we do not have a dual therapy with both of them, as they can both severely lower calcium. Now, real world evidence. This is kind of the new and exciting phase for us. So I'm really excited to share this with you. So this is coming from providers, much like yourself, that were based in IDOs and HBDCs. So again, this is a retrospective analysis. It's not a clinical trial. This is just looking at patient populations that were treated with Parsabiv and Sensipar and seeing where their outcomes then were at the end of the time period that we looked at. So patients were excluded if they had a PTH less than 600 or if they had a PTH greater than 2,500. Both calcimimetics had to be used on label. So the first prescription had to be for 5 milligrams, and for Sensipar, it had to be 30 milligrams QD as well. So what we saw was that in patients that were treated with Parsabiv, 62% of patients had that PTH reduction of greater than 30% over the 24-week period. With oral cinacalcet, we saw a 49% reduction over that 24-week period. And again, you can see at the bottom here, the mean doses of the calcimimetic. So this is weekly dosing. So we have 15 over weekly, so that's about 7, 3 times a week. And then for oral cinacalcet, again, we're looking at that 45. I believe is the average that it went there from start of study and then to end of study at 24 weeks. And then in looking at the individual SHBT metrics, we see for PTH over time, Parsabiv and Sensipar, which started at a PTH observed within 860 to 900, and the Parsabiv treated patients were able to get below that 600 measurement, whereas the Sensipar treated patients stayed above, just barely at 663. And then looking at phosphorus, we see similar results starting at 6. A phosphorus measurement is 6, and then down to 5.6 and 5.7 respectively. And then with corrected calcium, both patients observed starting at 9.5, and then with Parsabiv seeing reductions down to 8.7, and with Sensipar to 9.4. Again, this is not a clinical trial. This is just outcomes that were observed over time for patients who were treated at individual dialysis organizations or hospital-based dialysis centers. And looking at the patients who met that less than 600 PTH over the time, kind of lining up with KDIGO, we saw that 81% met that treatment goal as we compared it to what we saw in our post hoc analysis from our placebo-controlled studies. So recall there on the right-hand side that we had 85% in patients who met that less than 600 goal. And in a real-world setting and those IDOs and HBDCs, we saw 81% of patients treated with Parsabiv had a similar improvement in their PTH outcomes as well. And looking at the dose, so the dose is always going to tell a very compelling story. In the clinical trials and even in the head-to-head, the investigators definitely utilize the active titration every 4 weeks. So on the bottom line in that light purple color, that's going to be the placebo-controlled studies. And you see that the average dose was 7.2. In a real-world evidence setting from the IDOs and HBDCs, Again, we saw the starting dose at 5 milligrams, but the average dose at the end of the 24 weeks was at 6.8 milligrams. So we didn't see as significant as a mean reduction from baseline in the PTH, but that could also be because of patient response. Maybe they were started earlier, or if there was not aggressive as a titration as we clearly saw in our placebo and head-to-head trials. So I'm going to round out the important safety information for Sensipar. Again, just remembering hypocalcemia is definitely something to monitor. We do have different recommendations between Parsabiv and Sensipar, but both should be watched within 1 week. Check your calcium to make sure that it is not going below your normal limits, and then monitoring every 4 weeks after that. Once a patient has reached a maintenance dosing, you can then fall into your quarterly lab monitoring or monthly lab monitoring for calcium. Again, some warnings and precautions here around hypertension, worsening heart failure, and arrhythmias. Again, these can also be secondary to lowering serum calcium. So again, another significant reason as to why we need to monitor that as well. And then upper GI bleeds, we did have some incidences in both Parsabiv and Sensipar. Some were seen post-market. With Parsabiv, we did see that 2 patients were treated with Parsabiv, did have a GI bleed, but the causal relationship could not be established. So it is not known, but we did definitely include that in our label. And again, a dynamic bone disease, wanting to make sure that we don't over-suppress bone for any patient that has a PTH less than 100. And again, the adverse reactions that we really went through, the GI, nausea, muscle spasms, those are going to be kind of the more common adverse events that you may see with Sensipar or Parsabiv during use. So again, thank you for your time, and just your reminders that with Parsabiv, it is IV administration that you can control. We have seen the reductions over those 3 secondary HBT labs and also maintained out to 78 weeks. So thank you so much for your time. I'm going to hand it over now to my colleague, Bob Martinich.
Hi, Tana. Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity to be on. And I am Tana's colleague. My name is Bob Martinich, and I work on the coverage and pricing team alongside Tana with Amgen. And over the next 10 minutes or so, we'll be talking about coverage and reimbursements for Parsabiv. And we're really going to tackle it in the different payer groups. We're going to be talking most about Medicare, Medicare Fee for Service, but then we'll also do a quick review about Medicare Advantage plans, commercial, and Medicaid as well. So first, let's talk about Medicare and the Tadapa policy. Before we go into the extension of Tadapa, we'll do a quick review that Tadapa was first established for calcimimetics. Calcimimetics are the first therapy that used Tadapa for ESRD and patients in the bundle. And initially, Medicare said, starting in 2018, Parsabiv, Sensipar is going to be paid via Tadapa for a minimum of 2 years. And then as that 2-year time frame started to run out, they made a ruling last year that says we're going to extend Tadapa for calcimimetics through 2020. We don't have sufficient claims yet to value Parsabiv and Sensipar into the bundle, so Medicare decided to take that 1 extra year, which is happening through 2020. And they made one additional tweak to that, saying that instead of paying for Parsabiv, Sensipar at ASP plus 6, for 2020, calcimimetics are going to be paid at ASP plus 0. And so let's look at, as we look ahead to the future, we anticipate that Medicare is going to make another ruling, and they'll make their proposed ruling come July. And we anticipate that ruling is going to address how will calcimimetics go into the bundle. You know, there's a couple of things with that. One is, what's the methodology of how it's going to go into the bundle? And what's the value? How much, after they reviewed price and volume, how are they going to value, and what money will they put into the bundle starting next year? So we anticipate that that's going to follow the normal rule-making cycle, and then we'll get the proposed rule sometime in July, and then there'll be a 60-day comment period that they always have following that. And then sometime, usually, and it happens in November, we'll find out with the final rule of how calcimimetics may go into the bundle after that. But when we look at Tadapa and what Medicare extended through 2020, The Tadapa policy is basically, it's an add-on payment adjustment for calcimimetics. It is an adjustment just like any other payer adjusters that you've been getting all along. You start with the bundled base payment rate, and then the adjusters are added on, whether those are facility level adjusters, outlier payment, patient case mix adjuster. Tadapa is just another adjuster on top of that. And then the quality incentive program is the one adjuster that can potentially take money away from the bundle base payment rates. Now, when we look at Medicare fee-for-service coverage nationally, this is a national view, this pie chart that you see on screen, of what is the makeup of the different payers that cover the ESRD patients. 68% of ESRD patients are covered by Medicare fee-for-service. However, there's another 15% that are covered by Medicare Advantage plans. There's currently a prohibition in place saying that the only way that you should be able to be on a Medicare Advantage plan with ESRD is if you are on that Medicare Advantage plan prior to getting ESRD. Right now, that prohibition says that if you have ESRD and were not on a Medicare Advantage plan previous, then you're going to stick with the Medicare fee-for-service payer. We're seeing that that's probably going to change next year, and that restriction will be removed. 12% of all ESRD patients are on commercial plans, and 6% are on Medicaid. When we look at the Medicare fee-for-service, Medicare fee-for-service pays for 80% of the claim, and they pay for 80% of the PPS-adjusted bundled payment rates. 20% is paid by coinsurance. And a quick review of what that coinsurance should look like: some patients are Medi-Medi, meaning Medicaid is a secondary payer. Other patients have a commercial secondary payer, and still some more patients just do not have a secondary coinsurance. What we've seen is patients that have commercial coinsurance, the commercial plans do tend to pay for the secondary payment for Parsabiv. Medicaid, it depends on that state's Medicaid policy. In some cases, we are seeing that some state Medicaid is paying the secondary coinsurance. In other states, those plans are not paying for the secondary coinsurance. So that's Medicare fee-for-service. I want to talk and take a closer look at Medicare Advantage plans. A couple things to note here is with Medicare Advantage plans, it does come down to the contracts between the Medicare Advantage plan and the dialysis organization. So what that means is that Medicare Advantage plan, they pay a case rate to the dialysis organization. And when it comes to Parsabiv or Sensipar, depending on the contract, they may or may not pay an additional amount for calcimimetics. That really depends on the contract that they have with the dialysis organization. And so it might look different. One Medicare Advantage plan might have a different contract with among different dialysis organizations. So in some cases, they may pay an additional amount above and beyond the case rate, and with other dialysis organizations, they may not. One question that we do get from time to time is, Amgen, what are you doing, or how can you help us get coverage for Medicare Advantage patients? And really, we do not get involved because it is a contract that is between the dialysis organization and the payer. And those contracts, how they're updated and what they pay for, is really outside of our auspices. And so we have to leave that between the organization and the payer themselves. Now, commercial coverage works a lot the same way that Medicare Advantage plans do, in that reimbursement is going to vary across organizations, and it comes down to the contract between the commercial payer and the dialysis organization. One thing that we've seen with commercial payers is that some of them have required a prior authorization before they pay for an additional amount for Parsabiv or for Sensipar. But the prior authorization in this case isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a signal that if clinical criteria or whatever criteria is met, there's a path to getting Parsabiv paid for by that commercial plan above and beyond their initial case rates. Now, when it comes to Medicaid, instead of it being a contract, it's more of a policy-based system. Now, I want to make the distinction here that what I'm talking about now is Medicaid as a primary payer and not the secondary payer. When Medicaid is a secondary payer, it's secondary to Medicare fee-for-service. And like I mentioned before, Medicaid as a secondary payer may or may not pay that 20%. When Medicaid's the primary payer, their policy as a primary payer may be different than that as a secondary payer. And each dialysis organization should look before putting a patient on for Parsabiv, review your state's Medicaid policy, determine if Parsabiv will be paid for, and then, if it will, then make a decision whether or not to put that patient on Parsabiv or cinacalcet. Now, one thing that I'll kind of go back and review is after Medicare fee-for-service, the different plans that are in place have various policies of whether or not they're going to pay for Parsabiv and what that payment looks like. Medicare Advantage, commercial, Medicaid. And so we always encourage each dialysis organization to have a financial process in place or P&T process in place to find out before putting a patient on Parsabiv, will I get paid above and beyond that case rate? Does that policy mean that we will get reimbursed for Parsabiv? And then after that, the administrators or the financial folks in the dialysis organization give a green light and say, yes, it will. You're good to give Parsabiv for this patient, or maybe no, it's not. But make that determination between the clinical staff, the administrative staff, before putting a patient on Parsabiv, so there's no surprises with reimbursement. And so that concludes the formal part of the presentation. I want to say thank you to Tana, thank you to the audience for your attention and for your attendance at this webinar. And right now, I'll hand it back to Desiree in case we have any questions that are coming from the audience.
Thank you very much. I don't see any questions in the question box, but there was a comment that I think Tana was looking up the information for. So Tana, you want to address that?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a comment that came in if we could speak to heart failure and Parsabiv. So I just wanted to share that it's in both of the labels for Sensipar and also for Parsabiv. And when we looked at the placebo-controlled studies, we did see that 2% of patients who were treated with Parsabiv were hospitalized due to heart failure. That was in comparison to the placebo arm, which was 1%. So very small percentages, but not to be minimized. When we look at the N of these, it was a total of 11 patients for Parsabiv and 6 for the placebo. So definitely those patients who are at higher risk and have prior history of heart failure, you definitely want to monitor them, as some of this can also be secondary to hypocalcemia. So let me know if that answers the question for you.
Okay, hopefully that did. If you're still on there, you can give us a thumbs up, or if there are any other questions that anyone else has, now would be a great time to ask those. I don't see anything in the chat box. Let me double check our question box. Okay. So did you guys have anything else that you wanted to add, Tana or Bob? Oh, I do see one that came through. It didn't come through the Q&A. It says, how much does Parsabiv cost out of pocket? Is that a question you all can answer?
Sure, yeah, I'll field that one. And I'm going to read into the question a little bit, meaning if I'm not so much does Parsabiv, what does a Parsabiv cost? If it is the true Parsabiv cost, we can't talk about costs and reimbursement during the same presentation. And so I can't address the cost and pricing for it now, but I can refer you to your dialysis organization about what those costs look like. If it has to do with out-of-patient costs, then that really is going to come down to the payer policy and what they're reimbursing relative to, what patient responsibilities might exist. But that's as much as we, due to regulations, since we've been talking about reimbursement during this presentation, we have to stick to reimbursement.
Okay.
So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Bob. There's another question that came through the question box. Do you see that question icon up there? I'll let you click on there and read that.
Yeah, no, I do.
My pronunciation.
No worries. Yeah, thanks for the question, Yolanda. It says, how long do you wait before switching from Sensipar to Parsabiv? So per the label, when you're making that switch from oral cinacalcet to Parsabiv, we need a 7-day washout. So with Sensipar, if they're taking it QD, it takes about that long for it to get to steady state, and also with its half-life. So we want a full 7 days, and make sure that if it's possible to also take the medication, if there were any given to the patient at home, that you're getting that back in your hands as well, so that the patient doesn't mix them up and continue to take any oral cinacalcet at home. In our label, we recommend a 7-day washout, and then on the 8th day, you can start Parsabiv at 5 milligrams.
Okay, great. Any other questions before we close it out? Okay. Well, as I mentioned before, this virtual symposium was recorded, so we will have it on our website. Again, I'd like to thank Bob and Tana for doing this presentation today. We miss everyone in March. You know, we're very hopeful that we'll be in New Orleans next March 18th through the 21st. That will be our annual meeting, and we'll be able to bring back our face-to-face meetings. But in lieu of that, this is another great way to get the information out there to you. Just as a reminder, we do bring this virtual symposium to you, but RPA in no way endorses the content or the program sponsor. We thank you all for your participation. Have a great day. Be safe and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.